Okay, everyone, this is chapter 2 overview, and again, just going to go over some of the key concepts. Always read the full chapter. So here we go. All right, so this chapter focuses on economic inequality and the social problems that result from economic inequality. There are later chapters where we will look at educational inequality, we'll look at healthcare inequality, etc. But this one specifically is focused on economic inequality. And so one thing to consider about any nation's economy, even those that we think of as being socialist, such as North Korea or China, there's ranking in every society. Now, some societies are more highly stratified than others. The United States tends to be very, very stratified, more so than most of our peers when it comes to the post-industrialized countries of Northern and Western Europe, as well as Australia and New Zealand. We've got a lot of different steps on our ladder of socioeconomic status. And of course, we rank people into groups based upon things such as income, levels of educational attainment, the type of housing they live in, whether they own or rent a home, whether they own or rent a car or don't have one at all. All of these things are factors that we take into consideration when we're ranking people and putting them into or considering them to be part of a particular social class. Okay, so in the US, we're considered to be an open economic system, unlike a caste system, which in India they used to have, which meant you were born into a particular caste and you couldn't ever move out of that caste. Couldn't marry out of it, nothing. Born into a caste, you died in a caste. The United States is considered to be an open social class system, which means that if you're born into a working class family, conceivably you have the opportunity to move up several notches or maybe even all the way up to the top of the social class hierarchy, as some people have done. Oprah Winfrey is one of them. And so she's not the wealthiest person in the United States. I think that's Jeff Bezos. But she's, got a fair amount of wealth, but she came from a very poor family. And so in the United States, we like to believe that this is an open social class system, that movement upward is possible for all. And I'm saying upward because there are other kinds of mobility. There's downward social mobility, but I don't think most people want to talk about downward social mobility because downward social mobility means you were in the wealthier social classes and then you drop back down, and I don't, or drop down, and I don't think anybody really wants to go there. There's also lateral social mobility, so you move from, say, one neighborhood or one job to another one that is of equal status. But again, I don't think a whole lot of people care too much about that. I want to focus on upward social mobility because that's where I think most people think about, or that's what I think most people think about when they think about social mobility. And of course, this is all focused on this idea of the United States being a meritocracy. And meritocracy is the idea that everyone has access to the resources and opportunities that are available in a particular society. And so it's up to every individual to create their own social mobility. We even have cliches about this, every person, the original is every man for himself, but every person for themselves, or, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like you're poor, but come on, you can do it. And so it's a great idea, but I don't think it's really true. I think about how many of the people who have land in the areas of Minnesota, Michigan, Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, Idaho, North Dakota, even on, the East Coast, all the North Atlantic states, as well as West Virginia, Virginia, Pennsylvania, all along the eastern seaboard. Many of those people, and also in California as well, a lot of people in the United States who are white, they did not necessarily buy their land. It's been passed down from generation to generation. And one thing we know for sure is that owning real estate, owning property, is one type of wealth that typically will gain value. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but typically it will gain value. And so if your home, purchased by your great 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 grandfather, um, was given to him because he went west and um, sorry about that, because he went west and um, was able to get a free piece of land and all he had to do was farm it. And then 2 generations later, that land was sold and your grandfather took the money and bought a house in a suburban area. And now the grandfather dies and he leaves that to one of his kids, and then that person is going to leave it to you. That's wealth that's accumulated, but it wasn't actually earned. It was given. And so when you have that kind of wealth whereby you didn't necessarily earn it, but you were given it and it's just passed on from generation to generation, that's a huge leg up versus somebody who, like myself, I'm the child of Mexican immigrants to the United States in the 1940s. My parents came during World War II. They were braceros, farm workers, and so there was no wealth for them to pass on. There was no money for college even. So thinking about how the family into which we are born has a huge, huge influence on what our life chances are, what our life opportunities are. Okay, so social reproduction theory is another theory, all right? This idea is that what I was talking about with wealth being passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation, social reproduction theory says that inequality is bad for society. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is that social class gets reproduced from generation to generation. Why? Because the wealth is passed from generation to generation to generation. So if you're born into a wealthy family, the likelihood is that at death, you will still be wealthy. If you're born into a low income or working class family, the likelihood is at death, you will still be in the working class or low income social class. And of course, one of the things that I can see with social reproduction happened, I think it hit the news right back in 2018 and then 2019, really heard a lot about it. And even last year, we were hearing the last people getting sentenced. I'm talking here about the college admission scandal. Even Netflix created a movie. I haven't watched it yet. It's called Operation Varsity Blues. But essentially, you all pretty much know that there was a man by the name of Rick Singer who had a business that catered to wealthy people, and the business's sole purpose was to help the children of very wealthy people get into some of the top schools in the nation. And pretty much all the top schools in the nation were hit by this scandal. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. Even on the West Coast, places like Stanford and UCLA, USC. And so some parents paid as much as $500,000 to get some sort of help getting into the college. And in some instances, it was that somebody cheated on the SAT exam for them. So after they took it, the person corrected the wrong answers. In other cases, it was creating a false profile that this was an athlete of a team that was pretty obscure and nobody would pay a lot of attention to. And sometimes it was both these things in tandem working. And the long story short is that Mr. Singer was caught, as were a number of the parents who had paid for their daughters to gain admission, their sons and daughters to gain admission to these elite colleges and universities. And that's just, to me, a great example of this idea of social reproduction, that people who have wealth, they're able to pass it on, they're able to buy even some opportunities for their children that maybe their children wouldn't be able to get on their own. Um, and I don't know about you, but I think to myself, you know, if you're one of those kids whose parents paid a lot of money to get you into a college or university, how does that make you feel? Do you think, well, geez, that's fucked up. My parents didn't really have much confidence in me. Or do you think, wow, my parents loved me so much, they were willing to do something illegal? Um, I don't know. But it was not a surprise to those of us who know that there's a lot of corruption in college admissions. The the wool was pulled back, but it probably continues on. All right, so I want to take a look at the Davis-Moore hypothesis. This is a pair of sociologists, Mr. Moore and Mr. Davis, who are functionalist theorists in sociology. And so their argument is that social inequality is actually, or economic inequality is actually good for, it's beneficial for society. And they argue that here's why it's beneficial for society. They argue that in a very complex and postmodern economy that the United States has, there's a need for for people to do all kinds of jobs, right? We need people who are at the bottom, people who are willing to, you know, clean office buildings and bathrooms and prepare food and work in cafeterias, etc. But we also need people to work at a slightly higher level that requires a little bit more training, a little bit more skill. We need people to work another level that requires maybe a certification of some sort, like auto tech maybe, or CNA, LVN, etc. Then we need people with a degree or a license, like nurses or teachers, etc. And then we need people at the next level, people who have perhaps some additional training or who have a postgraduate degree, such as a master's or a professional degree like a JD or an MBA, etc. And then we need people who are highly educated and highly skilled to take on other jobs. And so for Davis and Moore, their argument is, look, not everybody in this country is going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or an architect. Not everybody has the skills and the abilities to go through that degree of education and come out on the other end a licensed architect, lawyer, etc. Some people, their best skills and abilities are useful at the lower levels, and that's okay. You know, everybody's got their own set of skills and abilities, their own level of intelligence. And so people then take on the careers or the jobs that they're best suited for, right? No harm, no foul. Also, Davis and Moore argue that people really have a choice about how much effort they want to put into social mobility. You know, some people will decide that they're going to drop out of school. Okay, fine. That's their decision. But if they decide that, then they're not going to have access to some of the better paying jobs. Other people will decide, okay, well, I'm going to graduate from high school. Fine, that's their choice. They're going to have access to other types of jobs. Some people will decide, well, you know, I'm going to go to a community college, I'm going to get a certificate or a 2-year degree. Fine, they'll be able to get other types of jobs, pay a little bit more than the other groups. Some people will decide, well, you know, I think I'm going to earn a bachelor's degree. And they do, and that's fine because that's their choice. They've decided to put in the extra work, and they will have access to other jobs that pay even better than the other groups. And some people decide, hey, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to get a postgraduate degree, a professional degree. I'm going to go all the way. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to network. I'm going to do all these things so that I can earn a very high standard of living, right, for myself or my family. Davis and Moore say that's fine. That's how it should be. People are, you know, have choices to make, and they can either choose to work really hard or maybe not so much, but that's okay because that's their choice. Another argument they make is that we have to give people who are willing to work the hardest and attain the most education and become the most skilled, we have to give them incentive to take on all that extra work and sacrifice. Because if we don't, then no one will want to work that hard. Here's an example of what they're saying. Their argument is very few people would become doctors or lawyers or engineers or architects if they knew they were going to get paid about as much as a high school teacher or as a police officer. Very, very few. I mean, there might be some because they just genuinely want to help people or they genuinely like designing buildings, in the case of an architect. But most people would not. In fact, I don't think I would have gone to law school if I hadn't believed that I'd be able to have access to higher level positions that would then pay me more. Not if I knew I was going to get paid just as much as, a high school teacher, because going to law school meant I had to take out a lot of loans, which meant that I was in a lot of debt when I left law school. And I went through 5 years at Stanford, then to law school. So I had a lot of student debt. And why would I take on a lot of student debt if I knew I was just going to get paid as much as a high school teacher? Doesn't make any sense. See, Davis and Moore are making some sense here. Now, of course, that's one view. It's one view about why social or economic inequality is positive. It's a good thing. Okay. I don't agree with their idea, but we'll get to that. I want us to consider what wealth means, because we often say wealth and income, and we are using these two terms interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable. Wealth is the value of all of the things that you have, that you own, that are worth something, minus how much you owe, what your debts are. So your house, your real property, your personal property, your car, your beautiful watch, big diamond ring, all those things, your furniture, your clothing, your laptop, your phone, all the things you have to your name that are worth something. That's one number. Then you've got to subtract how much you owe on that house or that car, or the jet ski or whatever it is that you have. And whatever's left, that's your wealth. That's your wealth. Income, on the other hand, refers only to the money you earn or that you receive, through investments. That's receiving money through investments. Money you earn, you go out, you work a job, you get a paycheck. So wealth and income are generally very highly correlated. Generally, the more income you have from either your wages or your investment income, generally the higher that income is, then the more wealth you have. The inverse is true. The less money that you are earning, or through either your job or through investment income, the less wealth you have. And the last statistic that I remember seeing a few years ago now was that about 50% of Americans have $5,000 or less in wealth. Okay. I remember during the pandemic also hearing in the news that about 3/4 of Americans, about 75% of Americans, do not have enough money to cover an unexpected expense of $500 or more. $500 or more. About 75% of Americans don't have enough. They'd have to put it on a credit card, or they'd have to borrow it, or maybe they just don't get their car fixed. Or maybe that debt goes into collections because, if it's your kid, you got to take the kid to the doctor. And if the kid needs some x-rays and, stay in the hospital, then you're going to have to do that. And you just maybe have to have a lot of debt because of it. So just think about that. Wealth and income are generally very highly correlated. Now, is it possible that some people have a lot of wealth but very little income? Sure. Is it possible that some people have a lot of income but very little wealth? Yes, that's true too. There are many people that are house rich but cash poor, meaning their house is worth a lot of money, but they also owe a lot of money on that house, and their payments are fairly large, And so at the end of the day, at the end of the month, they don't really have a whole lot in savings. But the house is worth a lot. If they were to sell that house, they'd probably be okay. But that's also where they live. They need a place to live. And then if you do sell the house, then where do you go live with the prices in California being so crazy? So here's something I want you to consider because it's so crazy to think about it, I think. The richest 1% in the world own almost half of the world's wealth. So I want you to think about that. The richest 1% in the world own almost half of the world's wealth. What that means then is the other 99% of people are going after what's left, which is 53%. That's a lot of people going off the little bit that's left, right? You think about the slices of the pie. All the slices of the pie are gone except for that one. It's a big slice, but it's still just one slice. And 99% of the people are going after that. The richest 10% of US households own about 80% of wealth. So it gets even worse. So that's the first statistic is globally. In the United States, the wealthiest 10% of households own about 80% of the wealth. Now that means that 90% of us are going for the 20% that's left. Now that one piece, it's not even there. You know what's there? Maybe a piece of crust somebody threw back in the pan, the pie pan, the crumbs from when we cut it. That's all that's left. There's no fucking pie left. It's just the crumbs and maybe the crusts that people threw back into the pie pan. That's what the rest of us are going after. And a lot of people have negative wealth. You know, they owe more than the value of what they actually own. And I know people like that. Unfortunately, I do. And you may know some people like that too. Only 14% of all households in the United States own stock. Again, that's something, the stock market, investing, that's something that if you're born into a working class or a low income home, nobody talks to you about how to make your money work. What we're taught, at least I was taught as a kid of immigrant parents, is work hard. If you're offered a job, take it. You never know when the next one's going to come along, and just work as much as you possibly can, and somehow, some way, it'll be okay. I was never ever, not even in high school or college, taught about investments. That just isn't something that's taught to kids, and I think that it should be. I'm a strong believer that financial education should be part of the K through 12 system in the United States. And that college students too should be taught about financial, I'm trying to think of the word, financial, they should be taught financial knowledge. All right, so let's see what I want to do here. Okay, I do want to focus a bit here on globalization, because globalization is when you have a world economy where there are not a whole lot of restrictions on trade between and among countries. And what tends to happen is that means that we now have access to a lot of different goods or a lot of different products, right? And we do, and most of us are pretty happy about that. We can access the Amazon app and pretty much order almost anything you can possibly think of, do a search for it, and there's somebody who's selling that thing. But at what cost? At what cost is what we might call fast consumerism or quick consumerism? At what cost does that have to the people who are producing these goods, as well as to the environment? At what cost? So I was reading an article a couple months ago about fast fashion. And fast fashion refers to how, well, before the pandemic, and starting, I guess, to pick up again, it used to be that there were seasons for clothes. So there was the fall wardrobe, then the winter wardrobe, then the spring wardrobe, and the summer wardrobe. And people really only bought clothes about 4 times a year, for each season. And if you live in LA, you probably never had to have seasons, but in other parts of California and other states. Um, but over time, by the mid 1980s, production was able to be speeded up. And part of that was because the global economy was opening up. And by the mid 1990s, the global economy was pretty much wide open, which means that multinational corporations, places like companies such as Nike, Adidas, um, American car makers, they were able to open factories in other countries, hire the workers in those countries to produce the goods, then send them back to the United States and sell the product for cheaper than if they had produced the product inside the United States, where they have more regulations and you've got to pay people at least a minimum wage. In those other countries, there are very few, if any, restrictions, and you can pay people whatever the market will bear, and you can work them as many days as you want, as many hours as you want. There aren't the labor restrictions that we have in the U.S. So some people say, well, this is great because it means that these countries that were more poor, now people have jobs and they're at least making, some wages. And it's these wages are something that they can count on, as opposed to if they were farming a plot of land. Nature isn't a guarantee. Maybe some years they'd have a good crop, maybe other years not, etc. So that's one part of globalization. But we also need to think about the automation and the technology that is now used to create the goods that we utilize, which on the one hand is great because it speeds everything up. It makes things much more symmetrical, much more um, much more standard, right? If we buy this thing, we know it's going to look like this, no matter what. The downside, of course, to this new technology and the automation of things is that these are things that people used to do. People used to do these things, and now machines are doing these things, or artificial intelligence is doing these things, which means then that we need fewer workers to do these jobs. Now, what do these workers do? Well, they continue to do the things that AI doesn't yet do. The service positions, right, where you're working face to face with customers, or you're cleaning buildings, or you're washing cars, etc. As a result of all this automation, that has meant that there are fewer union members. For example, within the car industry, a union job working for a car company, whether it was Ford or GM or Chevy, etc., throughout the 40s and the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, up until about the mid 1980s, that was a good union job. You could work all your life for one of these car companies, you'd have a pension, you could raise your kids, you could buy a home, you could have a car, you could live a decent middle class life with very little education because you worked at a factory and you were a union member and you had, all your benefits. Well, now fewer people are unionized. And so what that means is now fewer people have pensions. And so now they've got to be savvy enough to recognize, hey, I better be saving on my own. I better contributing to a 401k or to a Roth 401k. If my employer makes a match, I for sure better invest. I can't just count on Social Security. I am a huge fan of unions, partly because I grew up in a union family. My father was a union member. My brother and sister were union members. I was a union member, still am a union member, as a community college instructor. In fact, that is really the only reason that I was able to retire at 55. I would not have been able to retire at 55 if I didn't have a pension and full lifetime healthcare benefits, healthcare and dental benefits. Those are the only reasons why I was able to retire early. If I didn't have that, I'd still be working full time, and I'd still be living in LA. And I know some of you love LA. I was not born and raised in LA, so I always hated LA and was really, really glad to be able to leave LA. So again, thinking about how racism plays a role. Racism plays a role in economic inequality because there's been a lot of research done that what you look like, how you dress, even your name can influence whether you even get called for an interview. And so sociologists have done studies where they've created resumes that are very similar. So one person maybe went to Stanford, the other person went to Princeton. They both have bachelor's degrees in the same subject. They both have very similar work histories at different companies, etc. One person's name is a very very identifiable ethnic name. The other person's name is a very identifiably white name. The person who has the identifiably white name is much more likely to get a call for an interview than the person that has a readily identifiable African American or Latinx or Asian name. We like to think that it doesn't still play a role, that racism, doesn't exist as much as it used to. But the reality is, myself and other sociologists argue that racism is still around. It's just much more covert, meaning it's more hidden. It's more subtle. It's no longer the overt, hey, fuck you, beaner, wetback, spick, etc. It's more subtle now. But it's still there. And that, of course, has an effect on what kinds of job interviews we get, and therefore what kinds of jobs we actually have. Sexism is another big part of economic inequality. Women typically get paid about 80% of what men make, even if they have the same degrees and skills. Yes. Yes, I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. I'm not saying don't get your degree, women. I'm just saying be realistic about the fact that our society is very unequal. There's a lot of injustice. And then, of course, educational inequalities, as I mentioned earlier, the college admissions scandal, but also think about the social capital and the cultural capital. Social capital is the ability to, the access to a network of people who can help with resources and opportunities. Cultural capital is what, knowledge of the dominant or mainstream culture that will aid you in your profession or your career, or even just in your education. So here's what I mean by that. Social capital. Let's say I have a kid. I don't have any kids, but let's say I have a daughter. She's finishing up her junior year of college, and she tells me, hey, Mom, I think I want to go to law school. So I say to her, as a knowledgeable parent that I now am, because my parents didn't know this, I say, okay, well, you know what, you probably should work for a law firm, intern for a law firm this summer. I'll make some calls, see if any of the people I know at law firms their firms offer internships. I make a few calls. I get a couple people who say, yeah, we offer internships. They're unpaid, but we do offer them. I say, fine. My daughter doesn't care about being paid because I'm supporting her. And so my daughter submits her resume to the people that I know. They forward it to HR with a good word, and my daughter gets interviewed. She gets a job, or she gets an internship working for a law firm that summer. It's very helpful to her. That's me using my social capital, my network of resources, to aid my child. And I could do this for myself too. We can use our social capital for ourselves or people that are close to us. Cultural capital. My best example of this is, knowing table etiquette. If you work for a corporate entity, corporate organization, you are inevitably going to have business lunches, business dinners. And if you don't know proper table etiquette, the firm will not be very happy. If you don't know which fork to use, which spoon to use, which glass is a wine glass, which glass is the water glass, which knife is the butter knife, which is the knife you cut with, how to place your napkin properly, how to wipe your mouth properly, all of these things are part of cultural capital. And if you know these things, then you're going to fit in much better than somebody who's struggling with, okay, which fork do I use, which cup is this, etc. So I think that will be about it. Let me just really quickly check here. the ones that I wanted to go over. Of course, you should make sure that you are reading all of the chapter. Let me just double check. All right, yeah, those are the things that the main things that I wanted to go over. So I will see you for the chapter 3 overview.